Okay, so now we're recording. And the idea of this recording is that it only really records the person who's speaking loudly. It doesn't record other things. So in a minute, when we give the floor to Robert, he'll be the talking head. So there, like that. And okay, you've got 2 minutes. 2 minutes to get your papers in order, Robert.
My papers are in order.
Well,
I've been in the Lake District without Wi-Fi for 3 days, and so I've had all the time I needed to put my papers in order before coming out. No distractions.
A very fine literary place, the Lake District.
The first time I've ever been, actually, believe it or not.
We're now also saying hello to Michael Swift. Michael, can you hear us? Can you see us?
Well, he can. I think he can see us. I can see him. Anyway.
Okay.
Perhaps not. So, shall I begin?
Well,
not yet.
We'd better wait until 12:21, just in case.
Okay. Very good.
Joe wants to connect or something like that. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Mr. Robert Asch and to speak to us about the French side of this fin de siècle and Rimbaud. Is my microphone on?
Yeah, I can hear you.
I'll turn it off in a second. Okay, good. Just a little bit of background for those of you who don't know that Robert, Joseph, and I have sort of been friends for about 25 years and worked together in publishing in England. And this sort of theme has been something that we've talked about for most of that time. And Joseph Pearce, who you'll meet a little bit later today, made his name with a book called Literary Converts, for example. So it's great to be able to work together again on this project today and to bring together old friends and to welcome back also people who've been to visit us in Chauvin in previous conferences, James Ward, Ian and Maureen Gordon, and Michael Swift. Michael, can you see us? Oh, there's Mike. Hello, yes. Good to see you.
Hello, James. Yes.
Okay, so we're going to hand over
Michael,
to Robert.
it's so wonderful to see you.
Likewise. Sorry.
We're going to hand over to Robert now, so that we don't get behind on our schedule. And you've got the floor, Robert.
Thank you. I hope this fits into the form. I haven't had the opportunity to time the presentation. In any case, so this paper is entitled Arthur Rimbaud, Catholicism and the Art of Blasphemy. So I should like to begin this conference on Faith in the Fin de siècle with an examination of the life and work of Arthur Rimbaud, 1854 to 1891, an almost uniquely idiosyncratic figure who nevertheless exemplifies most of the leading and even contradictory themes of the decadent and symbolist movements in France and England. Let's get the ball rolling with a particularly apposite quotation from T.S. Eliot, perhaps our most valuable literary intermediary, as both the leading poet critic of the post-decadent period and a man decisively influenced by the writers of the fin de siècle. Genuine blasphemy, genuine in spirit and not purely verbal, is the product of partial belief and is as impossible to the complete atheist as to the perfect Christian. Baudelaire. From the surrealists through the existentialists to the 68ards and now the millennials, Arthur Rimbaud has been the embodiment of the poet as Orphic or Gnostic revolutionary. Quote, priests, professors, masters, you are making a mistake in turning me over to the law. I have never belonged to this people. I have never been a Christian. I am of the race that sang under torture. Laws I have never understood. I have no moral sense. I am a brute. Yes, my eyes are closed to your light. I am a beast, a Negro. But I can be saved. You are sham Negroes, you maniacs. In Une Saison en Enfer. Idol of the progressives since the 1950s or 60s, Rimbaud has been treated by the mainstream as the embodiment of enlightened youth in revolt against a conservative and morally compromised middle-class establishment, as a sort of Greta Thunberg figure, something which would have horrified him, incidentally. He was a supporter of the ultra-leftist Commune of 1871, and recent photographic evidence suggests he took part in its orgy of murderous destruction. But Rimbaud is not a safe or politically correct or progressive author. Les chiens, ce sont les libéraux. Dogs are liberals, as he wrote. Not a family of Europe that I do not know. I mean families like my own that owe everything to the Declaration of the Rights of Man. I have known all the sons of respectable families. His writings frequently evince contempt for the poor. His poem, The Poor in Church, describes a church warmed by the stinking breath of the poor, quote, 20 mouths yelling pious hymns, epileptics, a collection of loose-chinned women, beings like children who cry as if they were dying. Outside the cold and hunger, and men on the drunk. Notice the men are outside, incidentally. Happy, humiliated like whipped dogs, the poor to the good Lord, their patron and master, offer up their ridiculous, stubborn prayers, and sticking their noses into ancient missals are those blind led by a dog into the courtyards. And all, drooling a stupid begging of faith, recite an endless complaint to Jesus who dreams on high, yellow in a livid stained glass window. Misogyny is also a recurrent theme. But O woman, heap of entrails. There is a nasty little theological dig here. In the French version of the Hail Mary, the fruit of thy womb is translated le fruit de vos entrailles. Equally, the Blessed Virgin Mary is addressed by Christ as woman or O woman. Sweet pity, you are never the sister of charity, never. O unawakened one, addressing women again, with eyes wide but unseeing. When we embrace you, 'tis an answer that we crave. 'Tis you who hang on us, you udder-laden being, unquote. In later life, Rimbaud was even briefly a slave trader in Africa, and this was in the 1880s, when the slave trade was long extinct in Europe. Rimbaud is many things, but he is not a likable author, and his tendency to shock eclipses the fin de siècle's fondness for winding up the bourgeoisie. Indeed, beyond his creation of works of art of singular power and beauty, he is of particular interest to us for his extreme self-consciousness and the visceral thrust of his analysis and criticism in every direction, as poet, as a man, as a Frenchman, as a Westerner, as a modern, as a Catholic, as an antagonist to religion, as a revolutionary, as an occultist. He takes no prisoners. He also stands out for his capital yet equivocal influence on two seemingly opposed tendencies, modernism and the Catholic literary revival. Let's look at the latter first and return to it later in more detail. It might seem odd to some that Paul Claudel, perhaps the greatest Catholic writer of the 20th century, owed his conversion to a homosexual anarchist and blasphemer, but so it was. Quote, a mystic in the savage state, unquote, was how Claudel described him. Rimbaud opened a fissure in my materialist and penal servitude and gave me the living and almost physical impression of the supernatural, unquote. He explained himself at greater length. Rimbaud was the most signal influence I have experienced. Others, chief amongst them Shakespeare, Aeschylus, Dante, and Dostoevsky, were my masters and revealed to me the secrets of my art. But Rimbaud alone had an impact I should call seminal and paternal, and made me truly believe in a generation in the spiritual order analogous to that in the order of material being. I shall always remember that morning of June 1886, when I bought that little edition of La Vogue, which contained the first number of the Illumination. It was truly an illumination for me. I was finally able to escape from that hideous world of Taine, of Renan, and the other Molochs of the 19th century. of that prison, of that dreadful, oh dear, sonic problem there? Ferdy?
What's in it, but it's all right now.
Okay. Of that dreadful mechanical construct, entirely governed by wholly inflexible laws, and most hideous of all, laws both knowable and teachable. Other writers have taught me, but it was Arthur Rimbaud alone who put me together. For me, he was the revealer in a moment of profound darkness, the illuminator of all the paths of art, of religion, and of life, unquote. He made almost as profound an impression on another of the greatest poets of the Catholic revival, Paul Verlaine, also when Verlaine was still mired in the decadence and anti-clericalism, which were both features of the intelligentsia in both the Second Empire and the Third Republic. It seems pretty clear that this adolescent Antichrist, as he is often seen, had a remarkable power to provoke conversions to the faith, and to retain the strong allegiance of his converts, if we may so describe them.
Just a point of order, Robert. Could you move your screen for the sake of the recording, because we can't see your mouth, we can only see the top of your head.
Can I move it? Yeah, sorry. Is that better?
Slightly
Okay.
Slightly up again. Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
Thank you.
Who was this astonishing young man who, in the year of the Commune, 1871, fell on French letters like a meteor from outer space, whose life was over at 37, and whose entire oeuvre was composed by the age of 21? Who was Rimbaud? Asked the great 20th century Catholic critic Charles Dubos. I am well aware that I can only reply in the words of Cébès in Claudel's Tête d'Or. I do not know. If he figures among the ranks of genius as the most freakish of apparitions, as a man, he seems to me even more freakish, even harder to classify than he does as a genius. Just a moment, sorry. As Rimbaud himself once put it in one of his letters, je est un autre. I is someone else. Because of the depth of his influence on French letters, and both directly and through them on modern Western literature, and the extent to which his life was bound up with his work, the answer to this question takes on an unusual urgency. In addition, as Rimbaud has felt much more than Verlaine or even Baudelaire to belong to the secular world, the anti-clerical world, that is to say, the world in revolt, I think it would be instructive to examine him in particular relation to the leading Catholic and conservative men of letters of the 20th century. Rimbaud was born of somewhat impoverished middle-class parents of peasant stock in Charleville in the Ardennes near Belgium in the France of the 1850s, shortly after Napoleon's nephew had suppressed the Second Republic and reinvented the Bonapartist Empire, crowning himself Napoleon III. This was a compromise revolution, shoring up many conservative values against the revolutionary tradition, yet opposing the legitimist monarchical opposition that remained a potent force in France until the 1940s. The country was sharply divided, socially, politically, and religiously, as it has been ever since 1789. The poet's mother was deeply religious, but proud, humorless, and draconian. Rimbaud seems to have been close to his father, a good-natured soldier and Catholic of liberal sensibility. The marriage was not a happy one. Madame Rimbaud denigrated and browbeat her husband, provoking rows which eventually drove him from the family home, establishing a tyrannical matriarchy based on severe piety, hard work, and bourgeois respectability. The humiliation and flight of the father occurred when Rimbaud was 6. He was never to see his father again, and his parents' quarrels left a nasty, abiding impression on the boy. According to the poet's biographer Enid Starkey, this experience and his subsequent upbringing, quote, warped Arthur's personality, unquote. It is also clear that the dynamic between the devout but intolerant mother and the kindly, free-thinking but ultimately defeated father must have left profound traces on Rimbaud's religious sensibility. Rimbaud went to the local collège where he received a traditional Catholic and classical education à la française with a strong grounding in Latin and Greek, including composition. The French curriculum focused on the masters of the 17th century and excluded the authors of the great efflorescence of 19th century French literature initiated by Chateaubriand, Lamartine, Vigny, Balzac, and Hugo, a period arguably richer in variety and achievement even than that produced in England. Authors largely disapproved of by Madame Rimbaud, Until the age of 15, Rimbaud was a devout boy. At 14, he sent the Prince Imperial a Latin poem on the occasion of the latter's first communion, and one of the school's best scholars, jumping a year and carrying off prizes in multiple subjects. But the price he had to pay was heavy. His mother assigned him hundreds of lines of classical verse and Bible passages to memorize nightly, with the threat of beatings or being sent to bed without supper. His boyish imagination was starved of imaginatively appealing books, and he was ridiculed by classmates for the homemade clothes his mother provided him and his brother. The dynamite had been laid for an explosion, and the tinder was provided by the appearance at the school of a new young poet and professor of rhetoric, Georges Isambard, in 1870. In addition to treating Rimbaud sympathetically, Isambard opened the doors of modern French poetry to him and encouraged his literary ambitions. Unfortunately for Rimbaud and posterity, Isambard was a progressive, and Rimbaud fell hook, line, and sinker for anti-clerical leftism, which was to remain with him until the last stage of his creative development, when Une Saison en Enfer initiates a new departure. Close upon his earliest inoffensive efforts comes a spate of outrageous revolutionary material, just as the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 was beginning. Among the influences Rimbaud imbibed at this stage was the progressive historian and man of letters Jules Michelet, and through him, Vico. This provided him with a constant humanistic default option when afflicted with disillusionment, and it recurs even in Saison en Enfer. Millenarianism, a pseudo-religious consummation of history, enabled his stubborn deflection of the Christian option, the only one which could truly sate his profound spiritual thirst, while at the same time pandering after his hankering after the new, a different revelation of an ecstatic and mysterious future, and his recurring fascination with the destruction of the old. It is an almost Marxist vision without the cult of the proletariat. Enraptured by the collapse of Napoleon III's government and the establishment of the Commune in 1871, Rimbaud set off for Paris. Shortly before this, his sexual insecurity had been further shaken, and he was mocked for his childlike looks and poverty by a local girl who had taken his fancy. And then at 16, it seemed probable that, still a virgin, he was the victim of homosexual rape at the hands of Commune soldiers. Traumatized, he sent a poem obliquely referring to his ordeal to his mentor Isambard, whose mocking, incomprehending reply marked the end of their friendship. It is hard not to sympathize deeply for young Arthur, who had been the victim of betrayals of the most intimate kind. His father, his mother, his surrogate father and mentor Isambard, his faith in God and in the Commune. He felt betrayed by God and society and turned against all established order, domestic life, and social norms. But the ground of his being and sensibility was deeply religious, and the quest of the absolute remained. By this stage, Rimbaud had already written poems of uncommon power, irrespective of his age, which would guarantee him no insignificant place in the literature of his time. Ophélie, Les Effarés, Le Dormeur du Val, and Ma Bohème, for example. Rimbaud was an instinctive innovator, but unlike many innovators, he was able to translate his insights and intuitions into a series of fully realized masterpieces of remarkable range and subject and emotional register. Witness Le Dormeur du Val, The Sleeper in the Valley, clearly used as a model by Wilfred Owen in Asleep and Sassoon in The Dugout. Quote, "There's a green trough where a singing river clings crazily to tattered grass that gleams with silver, where from the proud mountain shivers sunlight and the valley foams with beams. A soldier, young, with open mouth, bare head, his neck bathed in cool blue watercress, under high clouds he sleeps, stretched on the grass, and light rains on him, pale in his green bed. He sleeps, his feet irises, his smile is like a sick child's as he naps a while. Nature cradle him snugly, he is cold. The fragrance wakens no quiver in his nostrils. Hand on his breast, he sleeps in sunlight tranquil. In his right side, there are 2 red holes." When Rimbaud returned to Charleville after his disastrous Parisian adventure, he shifted his mastery of verse in a new direction. He had been electrified by the poetry of the recently deceased leader of the symbolist movement, Charles Baudelaire, whom he described as a veritable god. There were many things in symbolism which were bound to appeal to Rimbaud: the color and exoticism it shared with the Romantics, its metaphysical implications, the preoccupation with transcendence and/or its absence, its formal concerns, technical sophistication and innovation, the strong presence of the subjective without necessarily rejecting the objective, the preference of suggestion to description or depiction, the hostility to bourgeois culture, especially bourgeois aesthetic and moral values. Above all, perhaps, Rimbaud is taken with Baudelaire's analysis of states of good and evil rather than utilitarian ethical values, and his belief in the secret association of things, including colors, sounds, perfumes. Rimbaud now began to read deeply in the literature of the occult and alchemy. He became convinced that he could outstrip Baudelaire through a mastery of occult doctrine, which could only be achieved by a systematic personal subversion of good and evil, which would open the doors to power over life and the state of beatitude. And this quotation is from a letter known as the Lettre du Voyant, written at the time. The poet, he writes, makes himself a seer by a long, prodigious, and rational disordering of all the senses, every form of love, of suffering, of madness. He searches himself, he consumes all the poisons in him and keeps only their quintessences. This is an unspeakable torture during which he needs all his faith and superhuman strength, and during which he becomes the great patient, the great criminal, the great accursed, and the great learned one among men. For he arrives at the unknown, and even if crazed, he ends up by losing the understanding of his visions. At least he has seen them." Unquote. It is interesting to note that while Rimbaud's transcendence of good and evil bears some resemblance to Nietzsche, it is distinguished by the quasi-Christian centrality of great personal suffering, which alone can lead to illumination. Having arrived at this exalted level, he could then liberate his fellow men from the shadow of the fall. Now poetry was to become for him the means to an end, enlightenment, an instrument of power over life, identity, society, and God, and he was prepared to lose his soul in the quest. From this point on, the blasphemies, obscenities, and political preoccupations withdraw to give place to visionary poetry. The locus classicus of Rimbaud's occult project is the sonnet on vowels. Black A, white E, red I, green U, blue O, you vowels, someday I'll tell the tale of where your mystery lies. Black A jacket formed of hairy, shiny flies that buzz among harsh stinks in the abyss's bowels. White E, the white of kings, of moon-washed fogs and tents, of fields of shivering chervil, glaciers' gleaming tips. Red eye, magenta, spat up blood, the curl of lips and laughter, hatred or besotted penitence. Green U, vibrating waves in iridescent seas, or peaceful pastures flecked with beasts, furrows of peace imprinted on our brows as if by alchemies. Blue O, great trumpet blaring strange and piercing cries through silences where worlds and angels pass crosswise. Omega O, the violet brilliance of those eyes. This is the period of Rimbaud's return to Paris and involvement with Verlaine, which need not detain us as it has been so extensively discussed elsewhere, though it is worth noting that Rimbaud profited technically from exposure to the elder poet's work, and both were remarkable innovators. It seems certain that Rimbaud was the first French poet to write in vers libre, free verse, and his last poems in traditional form involved remarkable experiments in freedom of technique, adopting Verlaine's lines of unequal length and introducing half rhymes and assonance. His use of sharply observed, emotionally unencumbered imagery appealed to Ezra Pound, who translated him. Quote, "I watched a little sprouting flush, the color of wax, flutter like a smile over her neat breasts, fly on a rose bush. Wearing out my shoes, 8th day, on the bad roads I got into Charleroi, bread, butter at the Green Cabaret, and the ham half cold." Incidentally, there are rhythmic echoes that one can detect between some of these poems and translations and some of the original work of Eliot and Pound. And the ham half cold conjures up, for example, the very dead of winter in the wasteland. The lukewarm ham on a colored plate, pink ham. The very dead of winter is in fact the Journey of the Magi, I beg your pardon. The lukewarm warm ham on a colored plate, pink ham, white fat, and a sprig of garlic, and a great chope of foamy beer, gilt by the sun. Rimbaud deployed words never hitherto used in poetry, trivial words, scientific words, obscene words, and colloquial expressions. It influenced the poets of the succeeding generation, such as Laforgue, and through them reached the modern poets of almost every country. How Laforgian and Eliotic, for example, is Rimbaud's To Music, translated here by John Gray, the famous English decadent poet. The square with gravel paths and shabby lawns, correct. The trees and flowers repress their yawns. The loutish roughs are larking on the grass. The sentimental trooper with a rose between his teeth, seeing a baby grows more tender with an eye upon the nurse. The rose here is a brand of cigarette, but the ironic discord is an accurate transcription of the original. Compare this sort of poetry, for example, with some of Eliot, for example, Mr. Eliot's Sunday morning service. Polyphiloprogenitive, the sapient settlers of the Lord drift across the window panes. In the beginning was the Word. In the beginning was the Word, superfetation of to ein, and the mensual turn of time produced an nerved origin. Or in Sweeney Erect, paint me the bold and fractious rocks faced by the snarled and yelping seas. Or compare Eliot's Whispers of Immortality. Webster was much possessed by death and saw the skull beneath the skin, and breastless creatures underground leaned backward with a lipless grin. Daffodil bulbs instead of balls stared from the sockets of the eyes. He knew that thought clings round dead limbs, tightening its lusts and luxuries. He knew the anguish of the marrow, the ague of the skeleton. Compare that, for example, with Rimbaud's Les Assis, the sedentaries, dark with wens, pockmarked, their eyes circled with green rings, their knobby fingers tightly clutching their femurs, the top of their heads coated with an indefinable nastiness like branching leprous stains on old walls. In epileptic romances, they have grafted their whimsical bones to the big black skeletons of their chairs. Their feet and the rickety crossbars are intertwined morning and evening. These old men have always been braided with their seats, feeling the bright sunshine make binding cloth of their skin. Again in Eliot, Grishkin is nice, her Russian eyes underline for emphasis. Uncorseted, her friendly bust gives promise of pneumatic bliss. Or, for instance, Eliot's famous line, Prufrock, let us go then you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky like a patient etherized upon a table. Prufrock was a sort of American Monsieur Prudhomme, the quintessential French bourgeois invoked by Rimbaud in Saison Enfer. Prudhomme, he writes, was born with Christ, as if to say Prufrock is a product of Christian sensibility in a state of decadent decay. Again, in Prufrock, in the room, the women come and go, talking of Michelangelo, the women being emasculated men, enerved origins, so to speak. And compare this with Rimbaud's Venus Anadyomene, as it might have been from under a green tin coffin lid, a woman's head with brown overoiled hair rises out of a theatre box, slow and stupid with ravages in rather poor repair. The ups, the fat, grey neck and bulgy shoulder blades, the shortish back going out and in, and the fat in clumsy slabs under the skin seems ready to emerge without further aids. That's translated by Ezra Pound. Like Eliot, but unlike many fin de siècle poets, it has been said of Rimbaud, disgust he knew and understood, and revolt, but never ennui. Like Baudelaire, Rimbaud is interested in the inherent beauty and poetry of the grotesque, and his poems display an unnerving sense of truth, which is echoed in his use of unusual synesthetic comparisons. They often have an especially vivid sense of color, which gives them the quality of a vibrant, dreamlike reality, as seen in the synesthetic color in Les Chercheuses de Poux, the lice pickers or finders. The boy's head full of red torment pleads for white swarms of cloudy dreams. And L'étoile a pleuré, the star wept rose-colored inside your ears. The infinite rolled white from your nape to your loins, both of which suggest an implicit synesthetic link between emotional state and color, writes Fiona Elizabeth Burrows. Witness the combination of synesthesia and contempt for bourgeois religion in this passage of the Proto-Eliotic What the Poets Say on the Subject of Flowers. Thus, always toward the black azure, where shimmers the sea of topazes, the lilies, clusters of ecstasy, will function in your evening. In our age of sago, when plants work hard, the lily will drink the blue feelings of disgust from your religious prose. Love lets through at your customs only lilacs, seesaws, and wood violets, sugary spit of black nymphs. This could produce a poetry of weird and mesmerizing beauty. The lice finders. When forehead full of torments, hot and red, the child invokes white clouds of hazy dreams. Two sisters tall and sweet draw near his bed, whose fingers frail nails tip with silvery gleams. The child before a window open wide, where blue air bathes a maze of flowers they sit, and in his heavy hair dew falls, while glide their fingers terrible with charm through it. So hears he sing their breath which dread hush curbs, how rich with rose and leafy sweets it is, it sometimes a salival lisp disturbs, on the lip drawn back or deep desires to kiss. Through perfumed silences their lashes black beat slow, from soft electric fingers he, in colourless grey indolence, hears a crack 'neath tyrant nails the death of each small flea. Then wells in him the wine of idleness, delirious power, the harmonica's soft sigh. The child still feels to their long-drawn caress, ceaselessly heave and swoon a wish to cry. Rimbaud's occult concerns dovetailed with his hermetic style. In this we can see the influence of Edgar Allan Poe, on which Eliot has written perceptively. Poe has a remarkable passage, this is Eliot writing about Poe, about the impossibility of writing a long poem. For a long poem, he holds, is at best a series of short poems strung together. A long poem may gain by the widest possible variations of intensity, but Poe wanted a poem to be of the first intensity throughout. It is questionable whether he could have appreciated the more philosophical passages in Dante's Purgatorio." Unquote. Poe's influence on France and through France on the world is incontestable. With Rimbaud, the purpose is connected to his hermeticism, magic. Only the necessary words must remain. Purge all that is superfluous so as to maximize the magical energy of the text, the potency of the spell, whose purpose is the initiation of the writer and reader into a visionary transcendent state. In Rimbaud's case, this concentration expressed itself in a revolutionary ellipsis and syntactical and grammatical irregularity. Because of Rimbaud's enormous and lasting impact on French poetry, these innovations were in turn transmitted via Pound and Eliot to British and American culture. And yet the type of maximalist intensity experience Rimbaud achieved and others have pursued with varying degrees of success is very similar to the effects habitual drug taking or computer gaming have on the experience of quotidian reality. The real world is affected by this. Rimbaud's case raises interesting questions about the author's relationship to a text, for example, parts of Illumination which can't properly be understood without some knowledge of occult science, of the differences between symbolism and magic. Magic depends on specific words, sounds, rhythms, combinations, and symbols for efficacy. However, these may or may not have worked for Rimbaud. They are integral to the production of great and highly individual poems. The culmination of Rimbaud's occult project is recorded in a celebrated and much misunderstood poem in Illumination, Morning of Drunkenness. O my good, O my beautiful, appalling fanfare where I do not falter, rack of enchantments, hurrah for the wonderful work and for the marvelous body, for the first time. It began in the midst of children's laughter, and with their laughter will it end. This poison will remain in all our veins, even when the fanfare turning, we shall be given back to the old disharmony. Now, oh now, may we, so worthy of these tortures, fervently take up the superhuman promise made to our created body and soul. That promise, that madness, elegance, science, violence. They promised to bury in darkness the tree of good and evil, to deport tyrannic respectability so that we might bring hither our very pure love. It began with a certain disgust, and it ends, unable to grasp this eternity. It ends in a riot of perfumes. Laughter of children, discretion of slaves, austerity of virgins, loathing of faces and objects, here, holy be all of you in memory of this vigil. It began with every sort of boorishness. Behold, it ends with angels of flame and ice. Little drunken vigil, holy, if only because of the mask you have bestowed on us. We pronounce you, method, We shall not forget that yesterday you glorified each one of our ages. We have faith in the poison. We know how to give our whole life every day. Now is the time of the assassins. Enid Starkey observes, Rimbaud seems, after long nights of watching, to have reached a state of total bliss. Alchemists call their metals in French corps, bodies, and there are corps parfaits and corps imparfaits, according to the degree of purity which has been achieved. It is possible that Rimbaud is referring in the opening of the poem to the perfection of the metal when he talks alchemically of le corps merveilleux, the marvelous body, and l'œuvre inouïe, the wonderful work, maybe le grand œuvre, the completion of the experiment, the philosopher's stone in effect. This is the first time he has attained it, and he prays that his pride, awe, and joy may not throw him off his balance. Fanfare, atroce, où je ne trébuche pas, appalling fanfare where I do not falter. The chevalet, rack, is a form of medieval torture, and it is here used as a symbol for the suffering of the poet. It is a torture through magic, therefore a chevalet féerique, a rack of enchantments. Extreme suffering is part of Rimbaud's aesthetic doctrine. It is the price which must be paid for the final victory. He who is held worthy of this suffering will enjoy the superhuman promise given to him, the unbelievable promise that the tree of good and evil will be cut down and buried forever in darkness, so that he can establish his pure and universal love. Unquote. Shortly after Rimbaud achieved this exalted state, he collapsed, physically and mentally. As he entered into a condition of spiritual crisis and ultimately despaired of his art, much as Gogol had when his writing failed to effect the universal spiritual revolution he cherished. This crisis is recorded in his final oeuvre, Saison en Enfer, which he called My Journal of Damnation. Une Saison en Enfer is an extraordinary work, a sort of greater poetic Catholic version of Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground, as narrated by a strange fusion of all four brothers and Peter Karamazov. Like the Notes, Saison is a work of art wholly preoccupied with self-analysis, and in that respect anticipates both the decadent movement and modernism. In Saison, we see the complete unraveling of Rimbaud's poetic, mystic, and social project, and even of his constructed self. Weeping, I saw the gold, but could not drink, he writes in Saison en Enfer. The three principal leitmotifs in Saison en Enfer are the problem of sin, the problem of God, his personal need to believe in God, and finally the problem of life, the acceptance of life. Blame of his parents and forefathers for his abiding preoccupation with sin and the drama of good and evil is a theme that runs through Saison en Enfer, and his repeated rejection of the Christian Catholic solution is seen in those terms, ostensibly an insistence upon full independence, which becomes a pathological paradox where Christianity is concerned, as he will always suspect any such acceptance to be the result of childhood and cultural conditioning. In reality, it savors of a radical and neurotic conflict with his mother and father, which can be traced to childhood trauma. It is also typical of the proud, fury hunted by self-consciousness. Horreur de ma bêtise appears at every turn, particularly when he invokes the aid of God and Our Lady. Finally, he renounces the West with its science, its progress, and its intoxicants, delivering men from its nightmares. He has loved science, has been a revolutionary, has drained every opiate to the dregs, but at least he is self-aware, and he is aware of how irreducibly he is a man of the West, even indeed especially in trying to escape from his Occidentalism. Rimbaud's faith in poetry did not survive his abandonment of visionary symbolism by more than a year. The last few illuminations were added in a realistic impressionistic mode, and then silence and flight into Africa, to attempt one last failed reinvention of himself, ostensibly like his father, never to return. Not for Rimbaud, Matthew Arnold's and Roger Scruton's dream of a literature which could shore up the collapse of religious and metaphysical certitude. If poetry could not truly save a visionary vessel such as himself, he had no further use for it, and discarded it in contempt and disgust. And indeed, as a matter of self-preservation, for, quote, as he lay dying and his sister asked why he had given up poetry, he answered that it was because it was wrong, and because he would have gone mad. My day is done, he writes in Saison en Enfer. I'm quitting Europe. Sea air will burn my lungs. Strange climates will tan my skin. To swim, to trample the grass, to hunt, and above all to smoke. To drink liquors strong as boiling metal, like my dear ancestors around their fires. I'll return with limbs of iron. and prophetically, women nursed those fierce invalids home from hot countries. But Rimbaud was to return one last time and leave us with a final tantalizing fragment, the disputed narrative of his deathbed conversion. In May 1891, Rimbaud returned to France for an operation on what proved to be a cancerous tumor on his right knee. In spite of amputation, the cancer spread quickly. His much younger sister Isabelle went to Marseille to nurse him through his final months. Isabelle was deeply attached to Arthur and proud of his achievements as a poet. She showed him a love and solicitude that he had never known in his mother's household. But as a devout Catholic, she was distressed at his spiritual condition. Enid Starkey takes up the narrative, quote, "Whatever may be our personal view of the spiritual value of deathbed conversions, there can be little doubt that Rimbaud was so converted. The letter which Isabelle read to her mother immediately after the event rings too true. In this, she is given too exact a picture of Rimbaud's mind for it to have been invented. She did not at this time know his work." Several times during the week which preceded his conversion, Isabelle begged the priest to visit Arthur, but he always found such weariness and disgust in the patient that he did not dare to speak to him of confession and of death. Finally, one Saturday, Isabelle requested all the nuns to send up a prayer after their own confession for a good death for her brother. The following morning, after High Mass, the priest returned to Rimbaud and found him more calm and resigned. He asked whether he would like him to hear his confession, and Arthur agreed. Then when the priest had heard the confession, he gave Rimbaud absolution and left the ward. Outside he met Isabelle, who was waiting anxiously for him, and he said to her in a voice of deep emotion, "What did you tell me, my child? Your brother has faith. He believes. Indeed, I have rarely met a faith of the quality of his." When Isabelle went in again to her brother, she found him singularly moved. But he was not weeping, although he was sadder than when she had seen him before. All hope of life on earth had now left him. He looked at her as he had never looked at her and said, "You are of the same flesh and blood as I, and you do believe, don't you? Tell me you do believe." "Yes, I believe. One must believe." Then he said wearily, "Then the room must be prepared and set to rights. The priest is returning with the sacraments. You will see what it will be like. They will bring candles and fine lace. White cloths must be put everywhere. Am I then so ill?" After that he blasphemed and swore no more, but prayed continuously. With the laying down of his arms, the hard outside shell broke, the Abyssinian mask burst asunder, allowing the imprisoned poet to escape, the poet who had seemed to shrivel up and die, but had only slept for nearly 20 years, until the light from beyond this world, the light that seems to fall on those who stand on the threshold of the grave, touched his eyes and he awoke. Now he looked once more on all the visions that had been his at the time of Les Illuminations, and allowed himself to enjoy them again. Sometimes he became a voyant, says Isabelle, a prophet. Without losing consciousness, he had the most marvelous visions. He saw columns of amethyst, angels in marble and wood, countries of indescribable beauty, and he used to paint these sensations, expressions of curious and penetrating charm. One evening, as he lay murmuring in a low voice, describing what he was seeing, he said to Isabelle, "Do you think, a sister said to Isabelle, one of the nuns, 'Do you think that he's lost consciousness again?' But he overheard her words. A blush flooded his face, and he became suddenly silent. And when the sister had left the room, he said to Isabelle, 'They think me mad. But you don't think me mad, do you?' Some critics allege that this letter of Isabelle's was written later by her husband, Paterne Berrichon, while Benjamin Fontana, the Romanian poet and Rimbaud specialist, says that he will not believe in its authenticity unless he sees the postmark, that Isabelle herself might have written it later. There seems, however, no adequate grounds for adopting so skeptical an attitude. The letter reads as if it was contemporaneous with the events described later. There are facts that she would not have thought of adding later. It is not easy to fake atmosphere. The letter is in the Doucet collection, and an examination of the writing reveals that it is in the hand that Isabelle wrote at this time, not in her later hand. Who then was Arthur Rimbaud? Antichrist, Catholic, revolutionary, sociopath? Socially and politically, Rimbaud, quote, "is the precise herald of our present abyss in the theory of sex, in part a disguised misogyny, implemented by a provocative tolerancy towards homosexuality with the aim of negating the Genesis narrative of man and woman, male and female, he created them. To liberate humankind from the age-old story, from these sexes and bodies, sex would become an open-ended potentiality. Androgyny would be the secret of superior beings. The love-inflamed and furious refusal of man's expulsion from the Garden of Eden, Rimbaud says, reclaim your first rights. Thus Pierre Bouton on the question of Rimbaud. And yet there can be no doubt as to his importance to 20th century literature. Paul Valéry, in writing on the French symbolist of the late 19th century, speaks of the high aspirations of this literary school, of its painful search for pure forms, determined by musical unity, and even for a kind of universal language of ideas, presented through images or symbols. But he concludes, a too rarefied zone had been reached, an air too pure and unbreathable, from which retreat was inevitable. Had not Rimbaud foreseen all this? He was, of course, the precursor of all the literary movements, which have been variously called symbolist or abstract or experimental. Elsewhere, Valéry observes, we have all been feeding upon Rimbaud these 40 years. It is disconcerting to think that such an influence has been exercised by a genius, however great, with such a damaged personality, the victim of the abuse of right religion and what can be called toxic femininity. Yet even here, Rimbaud escapes the stereotypes and has something to offer us. Not only does he bring back inescapably the religious and metaphysical quest, but surprisingly, it is childhood that emerges unscathed from the vision of the terrible adolescent. As to his Catholic identity and the question of his conversion, Eliot reminds us that, quote, an individual European may not believe that the Christian faith is true, and yet what he says and makes and does will all spring out of his heritage of Christian culture and depend on that culture for its meaning. Only a Christian culture could have produced a Voltaire or a Nietzsche, and, I might add, a Rimbaud. Poets live in their words, and I should like to leave the last visionary words to Rimbaud himself with Roy Campbell's translation of The Drunken Boat. I felt no more the guidance of my toeman as I came down by listless river coasts to serve for targets whooping redskin bowmen had pinned them naked to their coloured posts. Bearer of Flemish corn or English cotton, I cared no more for crews of any kind. When with my own the scuffle was forgotten, the rivers let me rove as I inclined. Into the furious chopping of the tides last winter, heedless as a child, I glided, nor have the unmoored headlands on their sides sustained so proud a buffeting as I did. The storm has blessed my watches in the spray. Cork light I danced the waves for 10 whole nights. Those everlasting maulers of their prey, nor missed the foolish blink of harbour lights. Sweet as to children the tart flesh of apples, green water pierced my shell with juicy shudder, spewing a wine of azure blots and dapples that rinsed me round, dispersing helm and rudder. Since then I have gone bathing in the hymn of a sea sprayed with stars and whitely creaming, devouring the green depths where flotsam dim, sometimes a drowning man descends half dreaming, where with slow pulsing and delirious fires, to flush the blue while day blazed white above, stronger than wine and vaster than your lyres, ferments the crimson bitterness of love. I've known the surf, the waterspouts, the tide, lightning split skies, the dusk, the dawn upheld like a whole swarm of doves, and I have spied sometimes what man believes. Lighting long wisps and violent panoramas, I have seen mystic horrors scrawl the sun. Far waves like actors in the ancient dramas unroll their flickering shutters as they run. I have dreamed the green night lit with dazzling frost, a kiss that to the sea's eyes slowly grew, the flow of saps to human knowledge lost, and singing phosphorescence gold and blue. Like mad stampedes of cattle on the prairies, with breakers I have charged the reefs and screes for months, nor dreamed the lit feet of the Marys could force a snaffle of those snorting seas. Blurring with flowers the eyes of human leopards, I've whirled Florida's none yet set eyes upon, where stretching coloured reins the iris shepherds her glaucous flocks beneath the sea's horizon. I've seen the swamps ferment huge creels of rushes, where rots a whole leviathan as it sleeps, amidst dead calms collapsing water gushes and distances cascading to the deeps. Glaciers, white suns, pearl waves, skies of red coals, at limits of brown gulfs, foul objects stranded, where huge bug-eaten snakes from twisted bowls fell dying with black perfumes where they landed. I would have shown those bream of the blue billow to children, those goldfish, those fish that sing. Foam flowers for my escape have smoothed the pillow, and winds ineffable have waved my wing. tired martyr, round the poles and tropics rolled, the wave, whose sobs my cradle rocked at ease, raised flowers of shade with spiracles of gold, and left me like a woman on her knees. Half island, tilting at my sides the frays and tail shots of the blonde-eyed birds that scream, I wandered, while across my flimsy stays drowned men descended backwards down to dream. Lost in the hair of coves, or like a shaft shot into birdless ether, I lost boat, whose sea-drunk corpse no Hanseatic craft nor monitor could salvage or refloat. Free smoking, by the violet fog embraced, have broached the sky's red wall and bored it through, which bears so dainty to good poets' taste, lichens of sun and mucus of the blue. Scribbled with small electric moons, mad plank with black seahorses harnessed to my gunnels, I have run while summer bashed to dust and sank the jet blue sky to swirl down blazing funnels. I who have quaked to hear at 50 leagues the rut of behemoths and maelstroms roar, threader of endless calms whom naught fatigues, am sick for Europe's towers of ancient lore. Starred archipelagos I've seen and islands where maddening skies to tempt the rover flower, where hide you in those nights of topless silence millions of golden birds, predestined power. But true I've wept too much, the dawns are fearful, each moon is loathsome, suns are sour to me. Salt love has bloated me and sogged me tearful. May my keel splinter and give me to the sea. If there's a northern water that I crave, it's the black slush at scented close of day, whereon a child releases sadly grave, a boat frail as the butterflies of May. No more bathed in your languor waves, I'll trim her sea wake where the cotton clipper flies, nor cross the pomp of flags and flames, nor swim beneath the convict hulk's resentful eyes. And thus, the drunken boat, le bateau ivre, and thus we take our leave of Arthur Rimbaud. Any questions? We have 10 minutes before the end of the session, I think, don't we? I can't hear anyone. There are no mics, no active mics.
I'd just like to apologise for joining so late.
Oh, no trouble at all.
Yes.
I couldn't
I couldn't work out what was going on, but I realised that there's so much else in England. We're lagging horribly behind the continent that we're kind of actually an hour. Our time is an hour later.
Oh, is that Dr. Speedy?
That's right. Yes.
Oh, you're not living up to your name.
I did not. No.
But we're sorry about the time thing. I mean, I should have made that a bit clearer. But don't worry, because we're recording the talk, so we'll make it available.
Yes, indeed. Yes, it's very, very interesting. Yes. But just to say, that's why I'm a little bit late. I wanted to be here, so we're pink and eager and bright and early and all the rest of it. But I'm here now anyway.
Yes, I also logged on at 11:40 British time, but evidently you meant 11:40 French time.
Yes, indeed. Yes.
So who's that? Is that William? Who's William?
William Griffiths. Hello.
Oh, hello, William. Good to see you.
And you.
Are there any questions for Robert?
I have a question for William. Are you in Malta?
No, not in Malta. I'm in Kingston upon Thames, which is my home. Though I do still have connections with Malta and go there from time to time.
Anthony O'Hare's just joined us. He's on English time as well, probably.
Yes.
Hello, Anthony.
Hello. I'm sorry, I just missed Rimbaud. Time.
Don't worry, we've recorded it. It was cracking. It was great.
Okay. I'll check it later.
Okay.
Yes.
Any questions from anybody for Robert before we move on?
Yes, Freddie. Is the
somebody's got a bit of an echo on the line there.
Shall I try again?
If you're not speaking, cut your microphone. If you are, put your microphone on.
Can you hear me, Freddie? Yes. Is the bateau ivre? Is it le jeu? In other words, is the poet comparing himself?
Yes, yes. I mean, that's the way it's generally understood. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
It took
yeah.
a while
He
to
is
come to
he is
terms.
le bateau ivre. Yes,
Yeah.
that's right.
Do you think it's a good image?
For him or in general?
That's a good question. Yeah, for him.
For him, yes, I think so. At least at that time, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. But how old was he when he wrote it?
16.
Oh wow. And what about Ophélie?
Ophélie, he wrote Ophélie when he was, I think, 15. I can find that out. I'm not sure that there's.
I've got the. I was supposed to have read this about 40 years ago.
I don't know how reliable a number of the the dating is for a number of his poems, because he never collected anything. He never published anything except Le Bateau Ivre. I mean, except, sorry, the Saison Enfer. Saison Enfer. Everything else was done without his consent and so forth, and so there isn't a very reliable, a consistently reliable dating system for his poetry. But let's see. I mean, they generally sort of identified with periods. So Ophélie, yeah, I think he was 15 for Ophélie, and Bateau Ivre, I think 16, or 17 at the latest. Don't forget, he's basically finished writing poetry by the age of 19, 20. So it's all packed in, mostly between.
The date for Ophélie is 15th of May 1870.
Right. Well, that would be 15 because he was born in
15,
October.
right. Okay.
Yeah.
He was unbelievably precocious.
Yeah, it's very rare. It's very rare, especially in poetry. You have, I suppose, that there is some remarkable work in music and maybe even occasionally in painting. One thinks of Albrecht Dürer was doing some remarkable things very young, and obviously Mozart and Mendelssohn. But in poetry, the only other example I can think of, which is sort of well, there's Chatterton, I suppose, but above all, there's Hofmannsthal in Austria, who's the same sort of phenomenon, although a very different sensibility. Most of his great lyric verse is finished by the age of 19 also. But fortunately, Hofmannsthal had other writing interests, and he was able to channel his creative work elsewhere. Whereas Rimbaud turned on literature with. It's a rather curious question as to why Rimbaud stopped writing, and nobody will ever really be able to establish it with any authority. But the reason he gave was effectively that. He came to see literature as in an instrumental way. He used literature for a purpose. He felt that the writing of poetry would be a means of liberating himself from the shackles of effectively fallen human nature, although he would have reinterpreted it in a different way. He sought to reinterpret it, and he felt that it failed, and to some extent I think he felt that he failed also. It became increasingly complicated because he evidently seems to have succeeded at a certain level initially, and then his health fell apart completely. But also increasingly, and he says this in Saison Enfer, he came to believe that his occult practices were essentially immoral. So he never lost the strong sense of morality. And he's not an atheistic poet, which is curious about Rimbaud. He's anti-Christian and anti-Catholic in much of his writing, but not atheistic. And the nature of God and his relationship to God is a constant theme in Rimbaud, and it's a very fraught thing. But one could argue also that it's simply a temperamental matter, that Rimbaud was essentially in common parlance, messed up, and poetry eventually led him to be more into more complications than he had before he began to write, and so he sought to escape into a life of action. There's also there's also one other rather suggestive thing, which is that his mother came eventually to be rather proud of him as a trader because he made money. I mean, he wasn't very successful, but he made some money. He wasn't insolvent when he died, and she had no use whatsoever for his poetry, even though by the time, before she died, there was already a statue to her son in Charleville. But she never visited, she never passed it. She would avoid the statue always. And she hated this men of letters and this sort of thing. And Rimbaud, I think, inherited something of that from his mother, this sense that men of letters were frivolous and contemptible and superficial people, that there was something shallow about the rank and file man of letters at the time, he felt, I think. And I believe he probably inherited some of that from his mother. So
did he seems to have inherited her contempt and her complete, an absolute rejection of his behavior, and the severity seems, to be resurfaces in him at certain points.
Yes, well, it does in peculiar sorts of ways. That said, though, it's very difficult to generalize. For instance, we know that one of the symbolist poets of the 1890s, I can't remember who it wasn't one of the more famous ones, but in any case, when they discovered that he was alive, because Rimbaud was thought to be probably dead by the symbolists, the young symbolists in the 1880s, when his work had begun to circulate. But it was discovered that he was alive and in Africa, and so one of them wrote to him. And they said, please come back. We will welcome you as our king. The place is set. Just take your rightful place and come back among us. And in spite of Rimbaud's impatience with discussing literature later in life, he kept that letter until he died. So obviously it meant something to him after all. But it's very difficult to say exactly what.
But may I just thank you for the last point you made about his conversion. I read the Graham Robb book, which he seems to dismiss all of that. And
well, Enid Starkey, who I referred to, Starkey is generally regarded as one of the most important English language specialist in the French literature of the 19th and 20th century. And Starkey was not a Catholic, and Starkey is essentially indifferent as to whether it matters whether Rimbaud died a Catholic or not. But she argues to me persuasively that there isn't any particularly good reason to dismiss it. I mean, the evidence, such as it is, appears to be fairly straightforward. And it's not intrinsically improbable. I mean, Rimbaud was very devout until he was 15. And it's true he rebelled against a great deal, but the grounds for his rebellion had to do with a sense of betrayal on his part. And then he eventually came to throw over once again the movement, the whole phase of his own rebellion as well. He came to be quite contemptuous towards that. And so in the last period of his life in Africa, he's very quiet about it. He wasn't a practicing Catholic in Africa, certainly. When he returned, when he was unwell after the amputation, he spent some time in Charleville recovering initially, and then the cancer, spread, and he had to go back to Marseille. He, I think, expressed one or two mildly anti-clerical sentiments about going to mass. I think about some of the peasants going to mass, but nothing particularly strong, and nothing like his earlier phase at all. And it seems obvious that there was a question of the integrity of identity that he was struggling with for a long time. The other thing, which is perhaps quite important, I think, is that his sister, Isabel, was she showed him the only experience he ever had of domestic love. And he was very profoundly moved by this. His mother didn't. His mother couldn't bring herself to be warm to him even when he was dying. And he was disgusted by it. He was deeply upset by this. It seems his mother was one of these people who just has a great deal of difficulty in being emotionally transparent. I mean, she did apparently mourn him after he died, and she was upset by it, but she couldn't bring herself to tell him that she loved him, and he felt rejected again. But Isabel gave him domestic warmth for weeks, and they were very close at the end. So I could imagine that had some significant influence, but one can't really know, you know. It's possible that the skeptics are right.
Thank you.
That conversion account, I've seen it in a few places, where the priest and the sister recount their memories of it. So I mean, the deathbed conversion, at least, is pretty widely reported.
But some of the conversations that are reported ring true. You know, like for example, where he asks her whether she thinks he's mad at the end, for example, because people are sort of whispering about him talking deliriously or semi-deliriously and so on. And yes, the descriptions of his poetry are quite interesting, because the letter is contemporary. I mean, it appears, you know, by handwriting analysis, not to have been a later reconstructed account, because her handwriting changed later in life, you see. Isabelle Rimbaud, or Isabelle Berrichon as she became later. And it's handwriting of the period of the death, and she hadn't read Illumination at the time she wrote this letter. And what she's describing evokes some of the imagery and so forth that you find in Les Illuminations. So it seems fairly convincing. I mean, to be honest, it's not absolutely convincing proof, of course, but it would seem to be the logical assumption to make, unless you had reason to not want to make the assumption, which I think is where most of the critics stand. They don't want to believe. It would seem like he'd thrown it all away, you know. Whereas in fact, he threw it away after he wrote Saison Enfer anyway. I mean, he threw away the revolutionary stuff, and he threw away the poetry and all the rest of it. He's not one of them in that sense, in any case, for the last 25 years of his life.
So thank you very much, Robert. We need to
of course move on.
Try and keep
my pleasure
behind with the timetable.
What's next on the agenda? No, thank you.
Me.
Is there time for me to make myself another coffee?
Yes.
Splendid.
I'll just say briefly why I'm giving this talk and how it came about. And if you want to go and make a cup of coffee, then
I'll take the computer with me. Yes.
Yeah. Now, Robert will probably be better talking about this subject than I, because he's more of an expert